Request you to take over. Uh, Thank you, all of you. Please do settle down. Okay. It's a great pleasure for me to chair this panel discussion with some eminent panelists on the topic of broader contours of science diplomacy. So I propose to organize the discussion as follows. I will make a few opening remarks, and we will be slightly modifying the order of the speakers. We have Dr. V. Siddhartha, former secretary, SACPM, and former distinguished scientist, who will speak first, followed by Dr. R.B. Grover, emeritus professor and former director, Bhabha National Institute, Mumbai, an expert on India's nuclear program. He will be followed by Dr. Malti Goel, founder, Climate Change Research Institute and former advisor, scientist, Department of S&T, and Dr. Pallav Bagla, science journalist, NDTV, and columnist, PTI. We're all familiar with his coverage of scientific events taking place. So after that, I propose to suggest to the panelists that they try and keep to about 10 minutes each, after which we will have hopefully an interesting discussion and then a closing of the session. So please do settle down. And during the discussion period, please do start by giving your name, so that makes it easier for us to identify you and for the record keeping of the discussion. First of all, of course, I would like to start by thanking Department of Science and Technology and RIS-NIAS for putting together this very, very innovative and important program. And many speakers at the launch opening session have already covered this, so I will not go into more details. So we look forward to a very active implementation of this project and a fruitful outcome of it. Well, we all know that science and technology has been assuming growing importance and for the economic and military strength of nations and their competitiveness. So this trend is going to continue and accelerate in the future. However, diplomatic practice and diplomatic activities still do not reflect this fact in its full dimension. As is the case of political and security issues and economic diplomacy, scientific diplomacy is still in a way, it's in an early stage. Advanced countries have evolved science and technology diplomacy and have taken the lead in fashioning international frameworks in various fields. For example, the nuclear, aerospace, biotech, ICT, etc. Scholars have identified three aspects, three dimensions of science diplomacy. First is science in diplomacy, whereby scientific inputs go into diplomatic policy making. Diplomacy for science, which is like economic diplomacy, where diplomacy is used as a tool to derive scientific knowledge and use it globally. And science for diplomacy, where science is used as a way of bringing countries together. So these are dimensions evolved by the Royal Society and the AAAS. But there are linkages and synergies between these three dimensions. Developing countries will need to evolve their own science diplomacy and not merely to react to developments. Example is the use of science and technology for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and for climate change. They need to protect their national interests while evolving international frameworks and focus efforts on their priorities and needs. These priorities are primarily science and technology for national development and national security. This translates into science and technology for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and for national security in its broadest sense, which covers all aspects of security, economic, energy security, etc. The means to achieve this require that we have a science and technology ecosystem in place which facilitates the development, acquisition, and application of science and technology knowledge. International collaboration, leveraging of diaspora assets, and creation of knowledge generation structures all are part of this. It seems that much more can be done by developing countries to gear up science and technology diplomacy, acquiring the knowledge and capacity building, which are the prime objectives, and the problem of how to manage science and technology diplomacy with limited human and material resources at disposal. We will need much closer cooperation and coordination between all stakeholders, R&D institutions, government, agencies, business, and civil society in the future. So with these broad opening remarks, it's a pleasure for me to invite our first speaker, Dr. Siddhartha, to make his presentation. Dr. Siddhartha.
Thank you. With the usual thank yous, which I will reserve for the last. And this business about a decade ago, David Baltimore, who was then the president-elect of the RIS-NIAS, accosted me outside the RIS building in Washington, D.C., after I delivered an invited talk on roughly this kind of subject. And they had not yet formulated their program on science diplomacy and diplomacy for science and diplomacy, science in diplomacy and so on. And he went on about that. And I said, look, please don't make these distinctions. They will soon become out of date. And as is usual with respect to all my advice, it was not taken. And he was, and they went ahead, and it then traveled across the Atlantic to the Royal Society, and someone in the Royal Society asked me. And I again gave the same advice, and once again, it was not taken. But never mind. So this is, I thought I would provide a conceptual framework from my perspective. Much of it actually has been, in its various components, have been dealt with this morning. And so I won't go through all that and try to go through this as rapidly as I may. The purpose of this framework is a growing trend of international collaboration, research and development. We should take full advantage of this, and for this reason I have placed science and technology at the forefront of our diplomatic engagement. So said the Indian Prime Minister in his address to the Indian Science Congress in Mumbai in January 2015. He might have said it in 1915 as well, by the way. And the repositioning of India in regional and world affairs was the Indian Prime Minister during his visit to the United States in September 2000. The first was, of course, the comment made by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and the second one by Dr. Manmohan Singh. The geotechnological positioning is possible only if a significant part of a country's technology and science and related military capabilities, and that should not be underestimated, are grown and shaped to be globally deployable as instruments of a foreign policy. For example, in the case of India, one of the non-carbon, we should try to be one of the non-carbon energy pioneers with co-responsibility for global climate stewardship. The Solar Alliance was mentioned this morning. And one of the nuclear weapons, 8, maybe 15 by the time, I don't know, until it's abolished. And one of the space security steward members of the Missile Technology Control Regime. Note, China has not been admitted to the MTCR. It's not undiplomatic. It was done quite deliberately. And one of the P7/9, perhaps, of the UN Security Council with global co-responsibilities was establishing and maintaining order in the contested global commons, which will include the seas. And there the science and technology element comes in quite directly. I'd like to make a morphological distinction in the leitmotif of this conceptual framework. International collaborations in scientific and technological fields is one, and S&T in foreign policy is another. They are related, but they are not identical. And when the findings of science or the use of technology may have ramifications for international relations beyond the S&T themselves, then you have S&T in foreign policy as an embedding. Then the pursuit of the S, or the use and control of use of T, influence and are influenced by foreign policy. And in S&T in diplomatic engagement, when a quid pro quo is negotiated in return for a country's participation as a state, as distinct from as individual scientists, using a scientific or other technological advantages, again as was mentioned, the locational advantage we had in the UN-sponsored tours at the magnetic equator. We have an epidemiological advantage because we have so many diseases in this country whose co-sponsored trials in tropical Latin America, and technological contributions in kind of subsystems, for example, for the square kilometer array in South Africa, and in the reciprocal use of facilities such as the GMRT, the giant meter wave radio telescope that we have built in Pune, and of course in Arecibo in Puerto Rico, for which we have reciprocal arrangements as a consequence of our GMRT's existence. And of course, non-reciprocal offers of unique facilities, example, the infrared telescope in Ladakh, Jammu and Kashmir, which is a sort of expression of soft power or slightly squishy power, if you like. And S&T in diplomatic engagement has a second aspect, and excellent relations with Mauritius enabled placement there in the late 70s of a satellite tracking station essential for our space program. But an instance of a dual-use S&T engagement with later adverse diplomatic consequences was in the nuclear field, and you'll hear more about that from Dr. Ravi Grover. The 1960 CIRUS reactor was built with Canadian assistance while the United States provided the initial supply of heavy water, and everybody knows that some of the plutonium for the 1974 test came out of there. Science in diplomacy with a hyphen, which is often eliminated in words, and as human threats to global commons become ever more severe. Global diplomatic negotiations over treaty-based national actions to mitigate them become increasingly underpinned by a common transnational appreciation of the underlying science. Now, the two hardly known Indian traces to international science informed diplomatic negotiations. One was the Kothari report on the effects of nuclear explosions, which eventually led to the Limited Test Ban Treaty, and the Kulkarni-Ramanathan 1940s work on the vertical transport of ozone in the atmosphere, not very well known elsewhere, but it was done, and it then moved on to ozone CFC chemistry. The science underpinned ozone CFC chemistry, which then went on to be the science basis, as again mentioned this morning by several speakers distinguished on the Montreal Protocol. And in diplomacy, exchanges has traversed from India being a targeted discriminatee after the 1974 test to becoming an MTCR member in 2016. In other words, the boasted discriminatee now becomes a discriminator, something, of course, that is in India's national interest to do. And then you have, since 1993, regulations were periodically notified using dual use in military materials and technologies whose export from India is controlled, again, as India becomes members of the technology control regimes after having been part of the target of the technology denial regimes. And Indian export control evolution over 2 decades, including the UNSCR 1540 WMD Act, where we were required under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Security Council resolution to put in place export controls, which were then, in 2013, selectively concordant with the existing regime lists. So by 2014, we have a situation where all the regime members want us to be members of the NSG, the MTCR, the Australia Group, and the Wassenaar Arrangement. We are members of all of them except the NSG, for which we have made it. There's a geopolitical basis for our non-membership of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, and that geopolitical basis is, in fact, a diplomatic engagement we currently have with the other members, including China, of that particular regime. Science rebalance to Asia seems to be, and a fundamental shift is taking place in the geography of science. Networks of research collaboration are expanding in every region of the globe. The established science superpowers, quote unquote, of the United States and Europe have dominated the research worlds in 45, yet this Atlantic axis, you see all these are diplomatic language that you see being used in unlikely to remain focused, etc. And the data-supported article in Nature of 18 October 1912 essentially said this as a result, and you had some expression of this morning. Again, this use of these expressions, Atlantic axis, science superpowers. These are all expressions which come from the diplomatic arena. And a conceptual confluence you have as the countries enlarge their scientific presence in more fields of S&T, more entities from more countries with similar scientific presences, sometimes measured in terms of publications, but others as well, as I had elaborated earlier, will seek to elaborate with that country's state and non-state institutions, and of course, conversely. As a country's dual-use technological capabilities diversify, as India's has, and as the underlying sciences themselves become dual capable, example, synthetic biology, and there's one person here who from the RIS who's written an extraordinarily good tract on that synthetic biology, increasing proportions of the implications. Mr. Srinivas, Dr. Srinivas has written a very, very good tract on synthetic biology. You should read that. And increasing proportions of the implications of these collaborations will lie at the confluence of technology and science, foreign policy and national security. And you have a global thing like that, which is security and national security. You have another one, an oval like that, which is technology and science. And you have one which is foreign policy, and the place where they combine together would be the arena where more and more of the trijunction of diplomats, scientists, and technologists and military people will need to collaborate in order to be able to advance the national purposes of a given state, and to do it in a way which is acceptable to other states through diplomatic engagement. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Siddhartha, and you've kept within the 10 minutes period. I now have great pleasure in inviting Dr. R.B. Grover to make his presentation.
Good morning, fellow panelists and distinguished delegates. This proposal to launch a science diplomacy program is definitely extremely useful. A lot has been already said about it, and theoretical framework as to various combinations of these two words, science and diplomacy. But I in particularly like the objective which has been outlined in the concept paper, that is scientific diplomacy for strategic thinking. Several examples are given in the concept note, several examples previous speakers have given. As a person who is a kind of, was a practitioner of science and diplomacy together, I will like to speak of a few kind of case studies which are not included in the concept note, but with which in some way I was personally involved. The first example has the beginning in the Atoms for Peace speech of the US President Eisenhower, delivered in 1953. It was followed by the launching of Atoms for Peace program by the United Nations. And this program created the ideological background for the creation of the International Atomic Energy Agency and launching of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Now historians, science historians have differing views, and one view is that it gave political cover for the US nuclear weapons buildup and the backdrop to the Cold War arms race. Under the programs related to Atoms for Peace, the US exported 25 tons of highly enriched uranium to 30 countries, mostly to fuel research reactors, and which the US itself regards as a proliferation and terrorism risk. Fast forward to 2009, President Obama delivered a speech in Prague to eliminate the threat of nuclear terrorism. With this speech, he launched nuclear security summit process, and 4 summits were held, 2 in Washington, 2010 and 2016, Seoul, 2012, and The Hague, 2014. One of the objectives was to secure nuclear material, and a significant part of this material was supplied under the Atoms for Peace program. This example, Atoms for Peace program and the Nuclear Security Summit process, they tell us how science and diplomacy is used to achieve strategic objectives. And I have, as a sous Sherpa of the Government of India, for all the 4 security summits, I was involved with all the preparatory works to know how exactly strategic objectives were being played there. A related example is the initiative launched by the Government of India to open up civil nuclear trade, international trade so that India could import uranium. A lot has been written about it, including by two foreign secretaries, both of them Ambassador Shyam Saran and Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon. They have devoted one full chapters in the books which they have written, which I think about a year back. I personally have written about it a paper in Indian Foreign Affairs Journal and more recently in the Progress in Nuclear Energy. Regarding scientific aspects, let me give two quotes about the US intent behind this program, and one quote is from Anish Goyal, who wrote a paper titled Nuclear Negotiations, Scientific Literacy and the US-India Relations in the journal Science and Diplomacy, December 2014. He writes, by the way, Anish Goyal was working in the White House when these negotiations were ongoing, and he was a part of the working group, the group from the US, delegation on the US side for several meetings. And he writes, after years of careful analysis and foundational work supported by scientific expertise, the nuclear deal was announced with great fanfare when Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh visited the White House on July 18, 2005. Note the words, analysis and foundational work supported by scientific expertise. Second is a quote from Sig Hecker. He gave an evidence at the hearing of the US Senate Committee on Appropriations Subcommittee on Energy and Water Development, April 30, 2008. Sig Hecker was director of the Los Alamos Laboratory and is renowned for his work on plutonium chemistry, and currently he is at Stanford University. He visited India, and one visit was in March 2008, just prior to the date when he gave the evidence, and he said, I quote, I found that whereas sanctions slowed progress in nuclear energy, they made India self-sufficient in nuclear technologies and world leaders in fast reactor technologies. While much of the world's approach to India has been to limit its access to nuclear technology, it may well be that today we limit ourselves by not having full access to India's nuclear technology developments. Such technical views should help to advise the diplomatic effort with India. Now, these two statements, Anil Goyal and Sig Hecker, they tell us how strength in science and technology is helpful in diplomatic initiatives. And here I would like to place science and technology together and convey that in place of science and diplomacy, we should say science, technology, and diplomacy. The dialogue between India and US resulted in a joint statement in 2005, which has several elements. I will not go through those elements, but one by one, what followed was a separation plan, IAEA safeguards, additional protocol to the safeguards agreement, negotiating with the NSG, and the result was a relaxation of NSG guideline in 2008 to facilitate civil nuclear trade with India. And since then, India has been importing uranium for its reactors that it has offered to the IAEA for implementing safeguards. Agreements for construction of 4 more reactors at Kudankulam have been signed, and dialogue with Westinghouse and EDF is ongoing. India has been able to join MTCR, Wassenaar Arrangement, Australia Group, and joining NSG is a work in progress. Here, based on my personal involvement in the entire process, what I can confirm is that the way science and diplomacy was intertwined in all these dialogues is something from which one has to learn a lesson. And as this project goes on, this will be a very good case study for the researchers to follow. As my next example, I have picked up the case of India joining the Project ITER, which was a commitment made by the USA as a part of the India-US joint statement of July 2005. To start with, ITER was an abbreviation for International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, and now the detailed part has been dropped. It's known only as ITER. Its starting point was a meeting in 1985 between Reagan and Gorbachev. It came to be known as, at that time, as Reagan-Gorbachev Initiative. In 1985, research on magnetic fusion was going on only in Japan, Europe, and the Soviet Union, and the USA. And Velikov, academician Velikov from Kurchatov Institute, and Dr. Alvin Trivelpies, who was director of Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the USA, they believed that taking the next step in fusion research would be beyond the budget of any of the key nations, and that collaboration would be useful internationally. The project ITER was proposed in 1985. It has gone through several phases. Design phases ran during the period 88 to 98 with equal participation of Soviet Union, EU, US, and Japan. And after the breakup of Soviet Union, of course, the Russian Federation has taken the role of Soviet Union. By 2001, an acceptable design was ready. Negotiations on citing the project and to arrive at an implementing agreement started. China and South Korea also joined. India was approached by the EU in 2004, but dialogue didn't proceed much further. But that changed in 2005, and after several meetings subsequent to the joint statement of July 2005, India was admitted to the ITER venture in December 2005. A joint implementing agreement was then signed in November 2006, and since then India is a party to the ITER project, now in construction phase at Cadarache, south of France. And here this project was India joining this project was a milestone. One can say that, if I quote the words of Dr. Chidambaram, he was used to say that this donor-recipient relationships in collaborations cannot continue forever, but this India joining ITER really changed it from donor-recipient to equal participation. Prior to joining India, ITER has been collaborating with CERN, and that's what I think Secretary DST talked about it. And this had demonstrated India's capability in science and technology to the world. And that was one motivating factor for other countries to invite India to join ITER. Subsequently, India has become an associate member of CERN, and now floodgates have opened. So many invitations to join mega projects are being received. Again, Professor Sharma hinted about it in the morning. Examples include LIGO, which he spoke about, Joule Horowitz reactor, which is coming up in France, and India is a party to that. Then collaboration with the Fermi Lab, then we have FAIR and Square Kilometer Array, and so on and so forth. But now it is time that India becomes discerning and take up only those projects which match our research priorities, because all these projects require both funding and manpower, and there are too many invitations which we are getting. And I also concur with what Professor Sharma said in the morning, that we should launch projects in India and invite others to join. I think Siddhartha had referred to GMRT in his presentation. This is one project close to Pune which is attracting a large number of foreign researchers to come and work in that telescope. I have concentrated so far on examples from my own personal experience, but I like to mention one more to which nobody has alluded so far, that is collaborations in agriculture, from which India has benefited a lot in the past, and this also can be included as a case study in the research work as it is launched. But in agriculture, one has to include milk revolution and veterinary science in totality. With this, giving these examples which can act as case studies for this project, I conclude here. Thank you.
I thank Dr. Grover for his presentation, and I now invite Dr. Malti Goyal to make her presentation.
So still good morning. Ambassador Dr. Balakrishna, Dr. Siddharth, Dr. R.B. Grover, and Dr. Pallav Bagla, and distinguished audience. I'm really honored and happy to be here sharing the podium with my mentors like Dr. Siddhartha, who was, for many years I interacted with him when I was in Department of Science and Technology, and in the audience, Professor Partsarathy, who is an expert on science diplomacy. So I really feel that it is a good opportunity given to me by RIS. But as far as science diplomacy is concerned, officially I was drawn to it when I was invited to a innovative energy technology science diplomacy workshop that was first held by the the World Academy of Sciences in Italy. That was the first time I really came across this term, to be very frank. And then it was told that we had a program with US on carbon sequestration leadership forum, and that program was launched by US in 2003, and because US had not signed the Kyoto Protocol. It was not, so there was a opposition from the American people. So they launched this multi-country program on carbon sequestration leadership forum. India became a founder member, and I was given the responsibility to steer the program. So as vice chair representing India, I had attended various meetings as a science diplomat, now I realize. Had we known at that time, I think the picture would have been a little different. Because US has been a leader in science diplomacy, no doubt. Not only in science diplomacy, but also in defense diplomacy, let me tell you very frankly. And they have been attracting all S&T good manpower for the benefit of the country, wherever it is available. So we were doing science diplomacy in DST. Many of us are still doing it, but we don't know really. And just to recall that just two years, exactly 2 years, 12th of May, we organized a brainstorming on science diplomacy. And Professor Chaturvedi may recall, actually we wanted him also. And at that time, the picture which emerged was very dismal. It said, what it was saying that it is, I mean, it was why we are going to, what we are talking of science diplomacy, what it is, who are going to do it, can we go to people and people-to-people contact when even government don't respond in many cases? I mean, this is the feeling that science diplomacy was, I mean, getting the attention, I mean, from the academic people especially. They said, we don't understand what science diplomacy is. And the way it has rapidly grown in 2 years' time, I think credit goes to RIS. So I must thank RIS to taking it, creating awareness. But NIAS, who are the partner, they have been in it. They did Indo-US Science Diplomacy Workshop in 2010, which actually led to a strategic program of Indo-US collaboration, which has taken a big shape now. And that was started by US. So most science diplomacies have come to India through developed countries, initiated by them. And we were party to it. Now, today, since we are discussing the broad contours of science diplomacy, I like to first of all say that it is an example of soft power against the hard power. Soft power, by I mean is, it's say persuasive power, rather than the defense hard power diplomacy, which was being followed during the late 20th century after the World War II. There was mostly secret diplomacy between the countries. and they were all related to defense equipment, defense transfer. So this was, science diplomacy has actually emerged as a soft power against that. And it is, earlier the threat used to be that there will be either defense interventions or economic sanctions whenever there was a diplomacy not accepted. So in, that was the case when we had with US after the nuclear explosion. That was there was fear of economic sanctions all around. So I would say that science diplomacy is a persuasive power, and the defense diplomacy is a coercive power. So one is a secret diplomacy, which is not actually known. Sometimes it happens very quickly, whereas science diplomacy is a thing which takes longer, because it has to be persuaded among the people, but it has a long-term effect. It is good in the long run. So this is the feeling I want to share with you about the science diplomacy. In one case, technology dominates, like, I mean, not IP or technology, but equipment dominates. In other case, it is the science which dominates. The defense diplomacy is more resource intensive. Science diplomacy is less resource intensive comparatively. But it requires more human resources who can really work on it, on science diplomacy. So as we have been seeing, US hard power approach in 20th century has been having a gradual shift to soft power diplomacy. And in many cases, science diplomacy has also been discussed under public diplomacy. So I thought these are the fundamental things. In the overall, one can say that soft power strategies are more effective in the contemporary international system today than hard power systems, hard power strategies. And now, as in the morning session, Secretary DST also mentioned that we are going towards the digital diplomacy, which is smart power. So both hard power and soft power merging, because nothing is secret, and the science communication is having a greater role. So we are moving towards that. The second point which I wanted to share with you is how to go about science diplomacy, because this is a key question. We always say, you have heard so many examples India has had, but really how to go about it. One thing is that in comparison to foreign aid or the provision of any other equipment or anything, the efforts are to be carefully aligned with the partner country. The partner country must also take equal interest, must have capabilities, must have the resources, and the resource commitment should be there from both sides as a science diplomacy, if we really want to succeed. For to be effective, it needs to be focused on the specific opportunity like social goals we have been talking about, because there can be two academic collaborations between two institutions, but they are not science diplomacy because it is for their own interest of advancement of science. They want to advance science, they want to progress, they want to do R&D, but that would not really fall into science diplomacy unless there is a national goal. Of course, social goal can be one of that, but can be scientific goal also, like you have heard big science projects in which now countries are participating because of the resource constraints. And there is a goal to achieve some new discovery, new innovation, which is going to be helpful to the world at large, and no one can afford it. So there are many examples, and India has recently, in recent years only, have joined 3 or 4 mega science projects in the recent years. So India is taking a lot of interest, but they are also mainly initiated by the developed countries. Now, when we talk of this part of the world, then what kind of science diplomacy we can think of? We can put a goal like how to go about getting science diplomacy for sustainable development goals, which has already been talked about. The Paris Climate Change Agreement and SDGs, which came in 2015, they are the biggest agenda today. We also heard the example of international solar alliances. So science, I would also like to mention one more point, is that it is it is also said that it is the non-governmental organizations and the institutions will take greater role in developing the science diplomacy, because he requires the scientific resources, manpower, and so that solved the problem, who is the actor of doing science diplomacy. And it is, in political parlance, we call it, sir, we call it track 2 diplomacy, in fact. So that is now developing. And the SDGs, as I said, it can be applied to achieving the targets of SDGs, which everyone thinks it is a relevant thing to do because it is social, and all of 17 SDGs are agreed universally, and they are supposed to transform the society from zero poverty to zero hunger to so many other issues which are related. And in each of the 17 goals, science and technology inputs are very crucial, because they look very complex, that 17 goals, 169 targets, but actually there are great interlinkages among them. If you achieve one, education, the other will get benefited, like you will have less gender disparity, you will have progress, and similarly energy, if you have energy security, then there are so many other benefits to come from, again, from the say from health point of view, from similarly cities, sustainable city, all are linked together. So all needs S&T input and all need linking. Now especially the 17 SDG, which is a partnership of goals, there it can play more greater role, because it suggests shared responsibility to vitalize the international cooperation, the SDG 17, which is only for implementation. So while progress in S&T affects all goals, the vital question is how we deploy science, technology, and innovation as a tool for regional and global diplomacy, and this point has been raised by eminent speakers in the keynote also. So here I would just like to say we also did a workshop on this, and last year, 2017, on role of science, technology, and innovation in SDGs, and it gave us a unique platform, because there were the speakers from government as well as from industry, and their participants were they were discussing the problems and practices on real ground, and there were youth involved who are the really torch bearers of SDGs. When 2030, they are going to be the actually transforming the world towards sustainable development. So this was the another point which I thought I'll make. We can go on about SDGs to any limit, but I will restrict myself to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Goel. I now have pleasure inviting Dr. Pallav Bagla to make his remarks.
Namaskar, sir. A delight being here in this august audience. Many in the audience I have had a chance to interview or talk to at various times. I am neither a scientist nor a diplomat. But let me say, on 2 decades of doing science journalism, there have been many occasions where we have, as journalists, been on the middle road in helping both scientists and diplomats. On the panel, we have Dr. Grover, a man who knows more about atomic diplomacy and science than anybody else. And he would recall when the Indo-US civilian nuclear deal was kind of stuck with the Americans wanting the fast breeder reactor to go under safeguards, there was a very targeted and sharp interview with Dr. Anil Kakodkar gave. And many say that was a game changer by way of keeping the fast breeder reactor out of the safeguards. So as journalists, we play a certain role both in diplomacy and science. And here I should also recall Dr. Grover's key things in diplomacy. when the Indo-US civilian nuclear deal was being negotiated, very early in the deal, whether a single word made a hell of a lot of difference. Should it be a safeguards agreement or should it be the safeguards agreement? Robert Saab, yaad hai na sir? And that would change the entire dynamics of how the nuclear deal would culminate. So as Sachin said, in the new India which is being thought about, I think science diplomacy is going to play a very critical role. And this meeting and this project, in my personal opinion, is very timely. Probably it should have happened much earlier. It hasn't happened. And if anybody has an impression that India has done bad in science, or done bad in diplomacy, or done bad in science diplomacy, please erase that thought. I have looked dispassionately over last 25 years, and I have seen India doing extremely well in all three areas: science, diplomacy, and science diplomacy, in using diplomacy as a tool and using science as a tool. But going forward, I will come to that towards the end, there has to be a game changer which will come in, and which is where, in my opinion, this particular project and this particular effort can play a very big role. As a journalist, as a communicator, there have been many, many occasions when this shoulder has been used for messaging. Messaging across borders, on the east, on the west, and ably used. I have always said, as a journalist, my job is to report objectively, fairly, and squarely. Let me just give one example. Take the case of, I gave the example of the fast breeder reactor. The other example I would give is when India was conducting its first intercontinental ballistic missile test, which is Agni 5, which has a range of over 5,000 kilometers. Siddhartha knows much more about the technology, but there was a message that needed to go out to the world that we have the capability. I was very heavily involved in the reporting of the making of the Agni 5 missile, the launch when it happened, and in the post aspects of the Agni 5 launch. It is a game changer missile, there is no doubt about it. It brings entire China into our horizon, it brings entire Europe into our horizon, except the Americas. Everybody else is in the theater of the Agni 5 missile. I was taken well before the launch of the missile and shown the making of the missile. Launch of the missile is just one event. It's, as has been said earlier, it is a weapon of peace. It can probably carry a nuclear warhead when it has to be used, so you don't want to use it. Yet you want to tell your adversary, hey guys, be aware, we got it. So you need to show what has been done. And I was shown not just the making of the missile, but the making of the ring laser gyro. Siddharth knows a lot more about that. These are critical technologies. These were shown to us and then relayed out. In the past, there have been several instances where we have done very well in science diplomacy. Take the era of Green Revolution. I don't think we would have been able to get anything of the nuclear deal or the space technology had we not done Green Revolution in the right way. Take the case of the Viking engine and the making of the Vikas engine, which goes into our Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle, into a GSLV, Geosynchronous Satellite Launch Vehicle, would not have been possible had it not been for some good science diplomacy. A CERN has been mentioned, a LIGO has been mentioned. What has not been mentioned is a very important aspect, which was the Chandrayaan-1 mission of India. Chandrayaan-1 was India's maiden outing outside the Earth orbit in 2008. It was a mission where India was the captain and there were many international players. And it came at a point when the Indo-US civilian nuclear deal was not in place. And I always say, and I have read, if you read my book, Destination Moon and the Reaching for the Stars, I have recounted the entire story in which how India kept its mission open to accommodate the Americans. The American scientists were very keen, but it was the Bureau of Export Control which was dragging its feet. So there are so many aspects where India has made immense use of its scientific capability and done well. Another aspect I would like to point out is the BrahMos missile, a joint partnership between Russia and India, both done well. In the past, there have also been instances where India has been attacked very heavily using science or scientific evidence as a tool. Go back maybe about 20 years. It still may come to haunt us, is the methane emissions, which were supposed to be causing a lot more global warming, and they were supposed to be emanating from paddy fields and from farts of cows in India. We were very heavily attacked at that point. Had it not been for the National Physical Laboratory and for Dr. Mitra, I don't think we would have been able to. Yes, obviously. DST is the umbrella body. We would not have been able to reach a point where we are big players in the climate change arena today. The same way, I remember post-Pokhran, there was a very important meeting where President Clinton had come to India, and there was a major event in Hyderabad. And the Department of Science and Technology was leading that science diplomacy event. And it led to the initiation of the dialogue, which ultimately culminated in the Indo-US civilian nuclear deal. In my opinion, even today as we are talking, there are several science diplomacy efforts which are ongoing. The Solar Alliance was mentioned, the South Asia satellite was mentioned. South Asia satellite is an ongoing experiment. I hope it goes in our favor. It's still a work in progress. What has not been mentioned is the current effort and endeavor by the Prime Minister Narendra Modi-led government on yoga and Ayurveda. Soft science, soft power, but a low-hanging fruit which was grabbed by Prime Minister Modi and taken to the world. And yoga has become such a vogue in most places, and it was a very easy thing for Prime Minister Modi to use. So traditional knowledge, traditional science, then being used as a tool for diplomacy and science. India's efforts on vaccines, pharmaceuticals, again, huge efforts made by India and dividends coming across from many, many places. One area which is currently heavily debated is the whole issue of genetically modified foods, especially BT cotton. If you had a lot of government interventions, as was mentioned here, because 80% of the funding comes from the government, here was a case where a private sector intervened and now is also suffering the consequences of the BT cotton intervention. I think it's an excellent study to be taken forward. Sachin, you are very well placed to look at the BT cotton as a case study of science diplomacy. The ongoing effort for India and US for the NASA ISRO Synthetic Aperture Radar Satellite, NISAR. It's going to be the most expensive satellite ever made in the world. And I say that with some firmness in what I have. It's a $1.5 billion satellite. Americans were not able to take it forward on their own till India put its might behind it. Both countries are doing it. 2021, we hope to see the satellite in space. A satellite which will give both countries powers to look at the Earth's crust like never before. An excellent example from a point where Americans were denying technology to a point where now both countries are going together for making a joint satellite which will help. In these 20 years of reporting, I have been a chronicler of science and science diplomacy. I have been fortunate to have had a ringside view of what is happening in this very interesting domain, and to see India change from being a country which was considered developing in science to a country which is, I would strongly say we are a developed country in science. Take atomic energy, take space, take agriculture. I don't think there can be any doubts that we are not capable or we are not developed. I think we should be classed as developed, and if it's an optional thing, like it was said by where Ambassador Mohan Kumar has gone, then we should opt ourselves to be as developed countries in that area. I think what we need, Sachin, in this area is many of these case studies needs to be collated together. These are small efforts which are written in papers like Dr. Grover has done. Two foreign secretaries have done a book on the Indo-US civilian nuclear deal. No scientist other than Dr. Sikka has written something on the nuclear deal. I have been coaxing Dr. Grover to write a book on the Indo-US civilian nuclear deal, and Dr. Kakodkar for a long time. Both have not done it so far. Before that is lost, I think some of these things need to be recorded and put into a form where they can be accessible to the larger public to learn lessons and take forward. The last thing I want to say is why, in my opinion, this particular project is so very important is the recipient-donor relationship. We were in that earlier. Times have changed. We are no longer in that relationship. With some, we may be recipient-donor, but for most others, we would be in a donor relationship. Our technology is available. Our technology could be well make differences for many, many other countries, not just in Africa, but across Asia and even parts of America, like we are seeing with the NISAR satellite. So this project is timely, and I hope it goes ahead and uses the skills of communicators like me to add value in a simplified fashion to this project. I have had deep association with the National Institute of Advanced Studies as a visiting professor. We did an excellent book out of that particular collaboration, and I'm hoping with NIAS and RIS and scientists coming together, it would result in learnings which would take India, as has been repeatedly said, to a new India. And my dream is in a new India where we are the donors and no longer the recipients. Thanks a lot for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Bagla. We now have some time for the discussion. Please keep your interventions short and focused so that we can have as many people as possible. I have here some names suggested. Dr. Sadhana Relia is one.
Well, good afternoon by now, since we have moved to 12:30, closer to that. I only want to say that I got an opportunity to be on the governing body of RIS once when our secretary didn't have time. I used that opportunity to make a proposal in the governing body to have science diplomacy as a niche area to be grown. So today this project is an outcome of that chance opportunity given to me. Secondly, I want to say that today if you read the newspaper, Indian Express, it says successful diplomacy lies in the use of words as noun and not verbs. Therefore, the comment, the agreement or a agreement makes a difference to rebalance India differently. And in successful diplomacy, the art of negotiating and managing anger and differences will matter. And can India, which is a harbinger of spiritual treatise, gave a new way of sharing, level playing and co-investment, be it for an economic advantage, be it for social good. I would like some very clear-cut case studies to be built by practitioners of international science and technology relations, or by diplomats, or by science communicators, because this message that this is coming up as a distinct discipline where the narrative of developing world must be outlined by India as a leader. That's about all.
I have a suggestion to make.
Well, the next request is with Dr. Sikka.
I have a small suggestion to make that currently very many of our Indian young engineers, scientists, doctors and technocrats or IT boys, they are joining the foreign service. And it is high time that we should create a crop of science diplomats. They can understand science, and once they are in the foreign service, they understand intricacies of diplomacy. And in this context, I have suggested to the Foreign Service Institute, as well as some other similar organization, the MEA, that Foreign Service Institute should start or should conduct short-term courses for the probationers or the foreign service probationers who are newly entrant in this area, or maybe middle level of foreign service officers who are already posted in the foreign countries. They can understand this language of science. Once they are posted outside, they can pick up the signals that what are the developments taking place in the foreign countries in the field of science and technology, in the emerging areas of science and technology, and then they can benefit the country back home. This suggestion is not only meant for India. This suggestion I am making for the other members of the foreign diplomats or foreign embassies who are sitting over here. They can also suggest the similar suggestion to their countries, so that a crop of diplomats is prepared and who can interact with each other in this area. So this is a simple suggestion. And by the way, I have authored this book on science diplomacy for the first time in this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Dr. D. Datta from Department of Science and Technology. Incidentally, I was India Science Counselor in Washington, D.C. from 2008 and 12, and then I was CEFIPRA, which was discussed, directed during 2012 and 15. So out of my experience, because what we are discussing about the contours of science diplomacy, I want to add there basically. Till now date, like we have only the theory of science diplomacy in terms of mainly the AAAs and the Royal Societies thing, like which is, as Dr. Siddharth has told, it's not very clear, and I totally agree with this because I was there when it was launched. I think this is a time, like which as a part of this project or the program, we must take and have our own, like, the theory of the science diplomacy, and to look into that, how the science technology or the science diplomacy has contributed in the development of the science, across the value chain, the science, the technology, and the solutions in that context. Because in the country, the science has, the benefited from out of the diplomacy. Technology, we have seen that what are the problems, but the solutions, like for the new India and the new world, we need to. And in that context, I want to bring out the importance of the co-investment and co-development, which has become the buzzwords today. And I want to bring up some of the case study which need to be done, which has worked out. Like, as you know, like when 2008, I went to Washington, the nuclear deal was signed, but till now it's not implemented. But there are certain things which has worked out, like between MOES, Ministry of Earth Science, and the NOAA collaboration, like, which has resulted in the national, the monsoon missions, like the main backbone. The CDC collaborations with Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, which has resulted into NDCC. Energy cooperations has resulted into JCRDC. These are the good, the case studies which should be studied into. And I think also we should look into how the S&T can be a part of India's foreign policy.
Thank you. Yes, Ambassador Devre.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a diplomat, I also have been involved in science and diplomacy for a very long time, and I can only share that science and diplomacy has been part of our diplomacy, an integral part of diplomacy for over 50 years or so, right from the time Pandit Nehru, I think, had focused on scientific temper in the country. I think speaking about science and diplomacy, I tend to think that we have two clear patterns or two sets of diplomacy right from the beginning, and it is practiced even today. Diplomacy, science diplomacy with highly developed technological states, countries, and diplomacy with developing countries. And while we have given even message to the world through our progress in diplomacy, be it our own development of cryogenic engine, or in the face of sanctions, our own development of space and nuclear industry. Even today, I think we require science and technology, particularly technology, for a host of our national development. And that, I think, can still come through FDI. FDI can remain one of the sources of technology in which the questions of intellectual property, IPR, becomes a primary concern. And therefore, FDI, IPR, these can also be part of this diplomacy program that is being conceived now. With respect to diplomacy with developing countries, we often talk of appropriate technologies, what technologies we can provide to developing countries. And today India is certainly in a good position to supply such technologies to a large number of developing countries. There is a tendency, which I must confess we have, of looking upon many of these countries as recipients. That donor-recipient relationship which we have faced from the developed countries and often not really felt very comfortable with that, we should not allow ourselves to have that kind of patronizing attitude to other countries, developing countries, when we are in a position to share our technologies with them. So I think we need to have a more rational blueprint as far as sharing our technologies with these countries is concerned. And I think that need not be across the board. It may have to be thought of very carefully with individual countries, what their needs are, what they specifically are requiring from us, and only that kind of thing we can share. So I think these two aspects can be thought of while we are now really going to conceive and develop this science diplomacy program. Thank you.
Thank you. We have But since there's not enough time, I would be very glad if people who have the questions could email them to RIS Secretariat, and whatever ideas they have, I'm sure they will take them into consideration. And you also have the opportunity in the forthcoming sessions to ask questions, because I think these subjects are all interrelated. So I would not like to trespass into the next session. So I'd like to conclude this session and thank you all, and thank the panelists for their contributions, and all of you for your attention and for listening carefully to us and making your comments. Thank you.